So welcome to another episode of Through the Bible. We're teaching verse by verse through the Bible. We're in Genesis chapter 38, and this chapter is kind of a brief interlude in the story of Joseph. The story of Joseph started in the previous chapter, chapter 37. It goes all the way through Genesis chapter 50. But this is talking about his brother Judah and how his brother Judah actually committed incest with his own daughter-in-law, and there were twins born out of it. And the name of these twins were Pharez and Zerah. And the reason I'm bringing this out before we actually get into the story is because in Genesis chapter 38 and in verse 29, it says, it's Genesis chapter 46, verse 12. It says, in the sons of Judah, and Onan and Selah and Pharez and Zerah. And it talks about them going into Israel or into Egypt when Israel and all of his children went into Egypt. And at this time, Pharez, this one of the twins that was born out of this incest that's recorded in this chapter, he already had children. The reason I'm bringing this out is to say that this only happened 22 years after Genesis 37, the previous chapter that we've already dealt with. And so for him to already be grown and have children means that this happened probably before Joseph was sold into slavery. But it's just put here, the placement of it isn't necessarily chronological just by judging by this one thing. But this is recorded in the 38th chapter. And again, this is an indication of what kind of person Judah was. Judah is the one who eventually, it was his lineage that Jesus was born through. Judah is the one that over in chapter, I think it's either chapter 44 or 45, will show you that Judah was willing to lay down his life and become a slave to let all of the other brothers go back to the land of Canaan. And so Judah had had a tremendous change in his life, but at this is one of the worst spots in his life, one of the lowest spots in his life. In chapter 38, verse 1, it says, it came to pass at that time that Judah went down from his brethren and turned into a certain Adullamite whose name was Hira. Adullamite just means a person who lived in Adullam was the name of the city. And it starts by saying at this time, so it could have been right around that time where Joseph was actually sold into slavery. In verse 2, it says, and Judah saw there a daughter of a certain Canaanite whose name was Shua, and he took her and went in unto her, and she conceived and bare a son, and she called his name Er. And she conceived again and bare a son, and called his name Onan. And she yet again conceived and bare a son, and called his name Selah, and he was at Chezeb, or something like that, when she bare him. And Judah took a wife for and his firstborn, whose name was Tamar. So Tamar was the wife of the firstborn And Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord slew him. You know, it doesn't give much detail right here, but just consider this, that Judah is the one who right here wanted to have his daughter-in-law, Tamar, burned to death, burned at the stake, and he's the one that committed incest with her. And so look how wicked Judah was, and yet God didn't slay him. For to come along and be so wicked that God slew him, it doesn't give the details, but we can rest assured that he deserved whatever he got. You know, the scripture goes on to say that the ways of the Lord are just and righteous in everything that he does. And so even though the details aren't given, we can rest assured that God was completely justified in what he did to this firstborn And in verse 8 it says, and Judah said unto Onan, go in to thy brother's wife and marry her and raise up seed to your brother. Later in Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 5 through 10, if you want to take time to look those up on your own, it was prescribed in the law that if a man died and he was married and he didn't have any children, any male children, that his brother was obligated to go in to his sister-in-law, his dead brother's wife, and raise up children unto her. And the reason for this was because if this woman had married somebody else, say in a different family or in a different tribe, then her firstborn would have taken the inheritance that was due to her previous husband who had died, and it would be transferred to another family or to another tribe. So to prevent that, Moses declared that a brother had to raise up seed to his dead brother's wife if they didn't already have a firstborn child. And so that's what Judah was referring to. And in verse 9 it says, "And Onan knew that the seed should not be his, and it came to pass when he went in unto his brother's wife that he spilled it on the ground, lest that he should give seed to his brother." Again, I don't think this is only because this man did not consummate the sexual relationship with his brother's wife, his sister-in-law, but I think it says specifically here that he knew that the seed wouldn't be his, and he did not want to do anything to bless his brother. Apparently, there was a lot of strife among them. Again, when you look at Judah at this time, he was a very ungodly man. He wasn't raising his children properly. Matter of fact, all of the children of Jacob were evil people, and there was just probably a lot of strife. And so this was as much hatred towards his brother and maybe even hatred towards his father as it was refusing to raise up seed unto his brother. And in verse 10 it says, "And the thing which he did displeased the Lord, wherefore he slew him also." So this is the first two sons of Judah that were killed by the Lord because of their evil life that they were living. You know, I could spend more time on this. I'm just going to mention this quickly, but there is a difference between sin, something that a person does out of weakness and out of failure, and a person that does it out of absolute rebellion. And I hadn't got time to go into all of those verses, but there are different punishments prescribed for things. And when people just intentionally rebel against God out of hatred for God, that's different than a person who sins out of weakness. Apparently, and Onan were people that were God haters. They were rebellious towards God. They knew what they were doing, and God just didn't put up with it and killed both of them. So in verse 11, "Then said Judah to Tamar, the daughter-in-law, Remain a widow in thy father's house, till Selah my son be grown, for he said, Lest peradventure he die also, as his brethren did. And Tamar went and dwelt in her father's house." So in other words, Selah at this time was too young to be given in marriage, and so Judah promised Tamar, if you will go live as a widow in your father's house, then when Selah gets old enough, I'll give him to you as your husband, in an attempt again for her to have male children out of this. But it shows you right here, he said, "Lest peradventure he die also as his brethren did." So he never really intended to give Selah to Tamar. He just intended to delay her, and he was never intending to do it. You know, Selah had already had two of her, or excuse me, I'm using the wrong name here. Tamar had already had two of her husbands killed, and it must have looked like that, man, she was just, the kiss of death. And it didn't look good. And so Judah did not want to give Selah to her. In verse 12, it says, "And in process of time, the daughter of Shua, Judah's wife," who was named Tamar, Shua, Judah's wife, died, and Judah was comforted and went unto the sheep shearers to Timnath, he and his friend Hira the Adulamite. And so he went down to shear sheep, and this was after his wife had died, and he had now gotten over the death of his wife. And it says in verse 13, "And it was told Tamar, saying, Behold, thy father-in-law goeth up to Timnath to shear his sheep. And she put her widow's garments off from her." Apparently, women of those days, if they were a widow, they wore clothing that illustrated that, similar to what we do today at a funeral. People will wear black when they're in mourning. So she put her widow's garments away from her and covered her with a veil and wrapped herself and sat in an open place, which is by the way to Timnath, for she saw that Selah was grown and she was not given unto him to wife. So in other words, Tamar finally recognized that Judah had no intention of giving Selah to her to be her husband, and so therefore she was going to be a widow the rest of her life. And in those days, women, their whole life was wound up in marriage and having children and raising those children. And it was a disgrace to a woman not to have a child. And you can see that with Rebecca and Rachel and many different places in Scripture, women really were committed to having family, and that's where their focus was. And Tamar recognized she was going to live the rest of her life in widowhood if something didn't happen. Judah never intended on giving his son Selah to her. And so she went and disguised herself as a prostitute. And in verse 15, and when Judah saw her, he thought her to be a harlot because she had covered her face. So this says a lot of things about Judah. First of all, he wasn't a godly man. He would have relationships with a harlot. It also says that Tamar recognized how susceptible to this Judah would be. In other words, all she had to do is just sit there and not say a thing, and she figured that he would probably approach her. It also says something about Tamar, that she didn't have a lot of scruples either. So anyway, she disguised herself, sat by the wayside, and he saw her because her face was covered. He didn't recognize who she was. And in verse 16, he turned unto her by the way and said, Go to, I pray thee, let me come in unto thee, for he knew not that she was his daughter-in-law. And she said, What wilt thou give me that thou mayest come in unto me? In other words, she wanted a hire for what he was doing. And he said, I will send thee a kid from the flock. And she said, Wilt thou give me a pledge till thou send it? And he said, What pledge shall I give thee? And she said, Thy signet, and thy bracelets, and thy staff that is in thine hand. And he gave it her, and came in unto her, and she conceived by him. So in other words, he basically hired her with his signet and with his staff and with his ring. And in verse 19, and she arose and went away and laid by her veil from her and put on the garments of her widowhood. And Judah sent the kid by the hand of his friend, the Adullamite, to receive his pledge from the woman's hand, but he found her not. Then he asked the men of that place, saying, Where is the harlot that was openly by the wayside? And they said, There is no harlot in this place. And he returned to Judah and said, I cannot find her. And also the men of that place said that there was no harlot in this place. And Judah said, Let her take it unto her, lest we be shamed. Behold, I sent his kid, and thou hast found her, and hast not found her. You know, again, this is amazing to me. People, when they are living in sin, they just don't think straight. But he's saying, let's not make a big deal out of it. Don't pursue her anymore, lest we be shamed. He should have already been ashamed for going into a harlot. It's amazing how people have selective conscience. And he didn't think a thing about harlotry as long as he could get by with it. You know, I'm going to make a big point out of this in the next chapter, that Joseph was just the opposite of this. And yet they came from the same father. They grew up in the same family. And yet Joseph, he honored God, and it didn't matter whether he thought he could get by with something or not. Judah, on the other hand, thought that, well, nobody's going to know about this. This woman's a harlot. And so he didn't think a thing about it, but he didn't want it to be known, lest he be shamed. He wasn't ashamed of committing adultery. He was just ashamed if people found out about it. That's terrible. And yet there are so many people that are like that today. So in verse 24, it came to pass about 3 months after that it was told Judah, saying, Tamar, thy daughter-in-law, hath played the harlot, and also she is with child by whoredom. And Judah said, Bring her forth and let her be burnt. This is amazing to me. Again, it shows you not only the evilness of Judah, but it shows you his hypocrisy. He was going to burn his daughter-in-law to death, and he was just as guilty as she was. He's the one who impregnated her. Matter of fact, his guilt was even worse because it was incest. It was a relative and stuff. And so anyway, it's just terrible. And the hypocrisy on his part that he was going to act so holy. This is another thing that you learn. This isn't just reading about things that happened thousands of years ago. This is happening today. There are people probably watching this today that you have done things that are just sin. They are out and out rebellion to God. And yet on other hands, you act so holy and so righteous, many times condemning people for the exact same thing that you have done. I tell you, this happens a lot. I won't mention the name of this minister, but he was a very famous minister, one of the biggest ministries in the world, and he used to preach against sexual sins. adultery and things like that. And he would get red in the face. I've actually seen his jugular veins stick out because he's just infuriated preaching against sin. And then it turns out that he was doing the exact same thing and he was exposed. And the hypocrisy of him being so vicious against it and yet him doing the same thing, that compounds the sin. Again, there's no good way to look at harlotry and adultery and stuff like that, but the hypocrisy of Judah in this instance makes it even worse, that he was going to burn his daughter-in-law for something that he was complicit in himself. And so in the next verse it says, and she was brought forth, she sent to her father-in-law, saying, by the man whose these are, am I with child? And she said, discern, I pray thee, whose are these, the signet and the bracelets and the staff. And of course, they were Judah's. And Judah acknowledged them and said, she hath been more righteous than I, because I gave her not to Selah my son. And he knew her again no more. So all of a sudden, the punishment was erased, because if he would have punished Tamar, he would have also had to have come under the same judgment. The judge was just as guilty as the person who was appearing before the judge. You know, in these days, there wasn't a government system like we have, and so if you break a law, it wasn't like that the government came and put you in jail or executed judgment upon you. People executed judgment like in their own family and among their own siblings and things like this, and they took the law into their own hands. And so in a sense, Judah was the one who could decide whether to put a person to death or not. And when he heard this about his daughter-in-law Tamar, he was going to have her burnt with fire. But when it was exposed that he was the father, he was the one who had sexual relationship with her, he wasn't going to punish himself, so he had to let her go. And so anyway, so Tamar became pregnant by her own father-in-law in this situation. In verse 27, it says, it came to pass in the time of her travail that, behold, twins were in her womb. And it came to pass when she travailed that the one put out his hand, and the midwife took and bound upon his hand a scarlet thread, saying, this came out first. You know, the reason they did this is because in those days, the firstborn got a double portion of the inheritance. And so to establish which one of these twins was the firstborn was super important. That's the reason they put this scarlet thread around the hand of that child. And in verse 29, it came to pass as he drew back his hand that, behold, his brother came out. And she said, how hast thou broken forth? This breach be upon thee. Therefore his name is called Pharez, which the name Pharez means a breach. And so that's how he got his name. And then in verse 30, and afterward came out his brother, that was a scarlet thread upon his hand, and his name was called Zerah. And so both of these children were born out of incest to Judah, but they actually were in the lineage of Jesus. Jesus was born through Pharez. So here's another lesson that you can learn. This isn't just reading about something that happened thousands of years ago, but even though this child was conceived in incest, and many people look at that and talk about how the shame and all of these things, and yet this was in the lineage of Jesus. Jesus was able to redeem this. And you can see the same thing. Rahab was a harlot in the city of Jericho, and yet she became in the lineage of David and then Jesus. And of course, Bathsheba was the woman that David had sexual relationships with outside of marriage and wound up killing her husband over in 2 Samuel chapter 12 and 11 and 12. And yet they were the ones that Jesus was born through. So this shows again that the Lord can redeem any situation. You know, regardless of what you've gone through, regardless of what's happened to you, the Lord can turn that situation around and make all things work together for good. So that's the end of the 38th chapter. In the 39th chapter, we'll continue talking about Joseph and the miracles that happened with him. Man, that's awesome. So I now only have 1,151 chapters to go.